We don't associate extremism with the outward appearance of academic responsibility. We don't associate extremism with the image of a gray-haired, elderly white man with a PhD. And yet, extremism often arises from the academic university context. And on the other hand, old and outmoded forms of extremism, unfashionable forms of extremism, like communism, well, the university setting is often where those extremist views go to die. It's often where they linger longest and where seemingly respectable gray-haired men with PhDs try to influence a new generation with their old and outmoded extremist views. So you can't judge these things on the basis of appearance alone. In this video, we're going to examine briefly two different extremist views on climate change, one represented by Dr. Jordan Peterson and the other by the leaders of England's Extinction Rebellion.
It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. What Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. You know, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming.
I'm not making this video to try and make out I'm some sort of hero. I'm just saying I'm in prison. And the fact of the matter is, other things being equal, it's not going to be a big deal. And also, like, it's not as big a deal as like being a parent, right? Having a baby and all that stuff. Because with one of my daughters, I was like up every night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, walking her up and down, carrying her up and down the kitchen. I'm sure many people who've got kids remember this. And all you're thinking for 5 or 10 years is, when the hell am I going to get to sleep? So compared with all that, right, going to prison is no big deal.
I'm in jail now. I'm in jail. I'm in jail. I'm in jail. I like it here. It's nice. I like it.
Like, the whole conventional campaigning thing is not working. It hasn't worked for 30 years and it's not going to work. It's just not going to happen. This is massive. How this is going to work is through mass economic disruption. Economic disruption. Economic disruption is breaking down the door. It's not pretty. It's not like well thought through.
Hello, Dad. I'm in jail. Hello. Hello, Dad. I am in jail. Say hi to Mom from jail. I'm in jail. I'm going to stay here. I like it here.
I got myself into prison because that's what's necessary. And the fact of the matter is, I'm sure there's loads of people watching this video, there's loads of people out there that are making all these excuses. And they're just excuses. You know, I can't go to prison, all that sort of stuff. You know, because of my family, because of my career. Well, the fact of the matter is, like, you could get arrested and go to prison and you could lose your job. But if you lose your job, like, then you lose your job, you get another one. It's not the end of the world. You know, you talk to your partner, you talk to your family, maybe you lose your partner. It's not the end of the world. You know, life is hard. People lose their jobs all the time. People split up all the time. It's not the end of the world. What's the end of the world is the end of the world. So...
And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop, like, having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like, you're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So...
We have this cliche in English that a man with a hammer is looking at every problem as if it were a nail. I think that cliche very imperfectly describes a profound and ongoing problem we have in politics, which is that people become attached to a solution They think of that solution in very hallowed ideological terms, and then they look around at the problem. They're looking for any excuse to apply, propound, advance that solution. Okay? That is very clearly the case with the extremism of Extinction Rebellion. Their whole discourse about anti-capitalism, their whole discourse about tearing down the government and ending the capitalist system, that was a hammer they already had in their pocket as a bunch of left-wing hooligans. That was a methodology they were already emotionally attached to. And then they see climate change and they're like, oh, here's a chance to show everyone this hammer we've got by beating on this nail. Now, we have an interesting contrast here with Jordan Peterson. I can't say it's a hammer he's clinging on to. I mean, the hammer is a little bit too active and muscular an image of being attached to a methodology or a way of life. But this guy is just completely committed to maintaining the bourgeois status quo. There is just no doubt in his mind that it's impossible to have a society in which people do not have cellular phones and cars and all these other things. All of the other, enjoyable accoutrements of Western civilization, specifically for the wealthier social classes. Now, I've lived in communist countries, and Laos and Cambodia both were in a situation of kind of post-war, post-communist devastation. And you can learn a lot from that scenario. I never lived in Cuba. I knew one guy who lived in Cuba and talked to me. Two different guys talked to me about what life in Cuba was like. But you know, one of the funny patterns you see in those countries where it's, at that time at least, relatively low tech, relatively simple life, is that there are tons of people who prefer that way of life. You'll meet people from Sweden and Denmark who move there and who say that they're happy not owning a car. You know, they're happy not having even air conditioning and so on. They may be literally living in a grass hut with either no electricity or very limited electricity. Now, of course, we're not talking about outright anarcho-primitivism. We're not talking about returning to surviving in Bronze Age conditions. Those people from Sweden and Denmark and Germany who came to live voluntarily in third world conditions in a village, they would be able to take a short trip to a major city and get dentistry, get access to a dentist's office, and that dentist's office would have electricity and modern standards of hygiene and modern medical science. They'd be able to take a short trip to have access to a hospital and those things when they wanted it. But it was not uncommon. It wasn't hard at all to find people who had rejected the kind of life that Dr. Jordan Peterson is endorsing here, and who were much happier living by the side of a river and bathing in the river every day instead of bathing in a proper shower, living in much more primitive conditions.
And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either, so it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like you're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that, and no wonder. So
the flip side of that is whenever you look at these places, whether it's, say, Laos or Cuba, you also have to look at the brutal reality of what it is that most people appreciate in terms of the enjoyment of life, in terms of the sensual pleasures that define life. I do not take myself as a standard for this. When I lived in Vientiane, the capital city of Laos, when I lived in that part of the world, I was riding my bicycle back and forth to the archives, back and forth to the library. I was spending my time studying books, politics, history, philosophy, languages, and also, by the way, going to museums and archaeological sites. You know, that was what I like to do with my time. Okay, let's be brutally honest about what it is most people appreciate about life in Laos or life in Cuba. Okay, alcohol, drugs, prostitution, a lot of prostitution in both of these countries, gambling. This is not what I do with my time. It's not what I appreciate. But when you look at the sensual indulgences that really matter to people, that they really find, including, you know, the exercise of their sexual freedom, in my case, the exercise of my intellectual freedom, my intellectual curiosity, the pursuit of education, the pursuit of learning. But for most other people, that's a much lower priority. So what you have to recognize is that even Cuba and Laos both, you know, Cuba has jazz music. Laos, they have their own local traditional music. People care about music and culture in ways that they can participate in. I don't actually think the bulk of humanity is so attached to individual car ownership, to commuting by car, as someone like Dr. Jordan Peterson, presumes. Now, I also do not adopt the extremist view that somehow the automobile and the cellular phone have to disappear from 21st century life in order to solve the climate crisis. I think that is pseudoscience in the strictest sense of the term. You can do the math and you can figure out that eliminating beef from the human diet, just beef, without even getting into fish and chicken, if you just eliminated beef from the human diet, enormous impact. And if you build more railroads and provide buses, there are tremendous differences we can make without taking away people's cellular phones.
I can't go to prison, all that sort of stuff. Because of my family, because of my career. But if you lose your job, then you lose your job, you get another one. It's not the end of the world. You talk to your partner, you talk to your family, maybe you lose your partner. It's not the end of the world. Life is hard, people lose their jobs all the time, people split up all the time. It's not the end of the world. What's the end of the world is the end of the world.
The hammer is not very well suited to the nail. In fact, the solution they're proposing is wildly, laughably irrelevant to the particular problem. And as you can see, they take this all the way. They are extremists. In that video clip, they were explaining to you why you should be perfectly happy to go to jail. You should get over your excuses for why it is you don't want to go to prison. Let me tell you something, guys. The type of activism Extinction Rebellion is engaged in, it's ineffective, to say the least. But about the single most ineffective thing you can do with your time is sitting in a prison cell. Got a message here from ODS. He's in university studying something like ecology or politics of, I don't know exactly what his major is, something along these lines. He writes to me saying, "Your video kind of woke me up again from a false perception of what the object of climate change really is. In my class alone, there are 3 climate activists that organized the so-called climate strikes in my city to gain awareness from the authorities. Quote, system change, not climate change, close quote, you know the deal. There are so many more effective and worthwhile ways to change local government policy in Switzerland than to strike, school, and protest in the streets for 2 hours at a time, many times over." Okay, pause here. The point is here, Switzerland is a real democracy. They may be the best democracy in the world in terms of the quality of the system. Be a separate video to evaluate that. Who's got a better democratic system, Switzerland or Sweden? Go through the Denmark, go through the leading lights for having a well-run democratic system. Here in Taiwan, we have a pretty good democratic system too, by the way. We might rank in the top 10 here in Taiwan. But regardless, your situation is fundamentally different in Switzerland, where the government is open to hearing your voice, where you can influence government policy in many ways, peacefully by participating in the democratic system. That's completely different from the situation in Saudi Arabia. Okay? Saudi Arabia is an outright dictatorship. The situation in communist China, which is in some ways a dictatorship, but in some ways a very different culture for public politics than Saudi Arabia. So there are degrees of despotism, there are degrees of dictatorship, and you have to recognize how much more productively you could be spending your time if you are lucky enough to live in a well-functioning democratic system like Switzerland. But what's the problem here? The problem is that these protesters, they've got a hammer and they're looking for a nail. They're already emotionally attached to this fixed idea, the hallowed image of protesting in the streets, and they're taking that idealized notion of street protest and they're applying it to this, quote-unquote system change. This is probably just a new coat of paint over the old anti-capitalism. This is crypto-Marxism, crypto-communism, anti-capitalism, and trying to say, well, let's not talk about ecology. Let's just talk about bringing down the quote-unquote capitalist system. Right. So again, attachment to the method, and then the particular problem, in this case an ecological problem, just becomes an excuse to propound that radical and radicalizing method. I have a geography teacher who wants to look at collapsology and Marxism to learn about society's problems while telling us students every second lesson about how bleak society's future is. Even knowing all the facts, frankly, better than everyone around me, he's even aware of the 2 cynical solutions I gave in that video. I was talking about practical technological solutions for climate change. I somehow got lured into some of the motivating forces of the lies told about climate change, that it's all about saving society from imminent collapse. I was the one to point out to these activists what I considered the gravest, most irreversible threat to the planet, ocean acidification, but I still somehow got dissuaded from its importance. So you see how this works. You live in a social situation where certain types of attitudes are being valorized, are being encouraged, and when those attitudes are linked to something as alarming and motivating as the end of the world, you will inevitably start to get some of the same behaviors that we associate with fringe cult groups, where human beings are behaving in a manner that reflects the fact that they believe the world is about to end. That's exactly the scenario that Extinction Rebellion has embraced with gusto.
You know, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming.
What Dr. Jordan Peterson is attached to here is an idea of what it is to have a meaningful life, of what it is to have a happy life. And he wants to, I mean, to his credit, he wants to extend that to more of the world. He talks about how he wants poverty-stricken people in Africa to have this same quality of life, for them to also have cars and cellular phones. They can also live a life like people in Detroit, having to drive an hour and a half to get anywhere and park in a horrible parking lot in front of a big box store. Woo! The assumption that America's pattern of development is what third world countries need is deeply, deeply flawed. But anyway, he's attached to a very different kind of solution and then is misperceiving the problem in relation to that preconceived and hallowed solution. Both of these forms of extremism are predicated upon very fundamental errors. One of them is predicated on an emotional attachment to radicalism, and the other is predicated on a false attachment to a particular type of life of reckless, self-centered self-indulgence. And I think the reality is, if you even look at the type of self-indulgence that really matters to people with an open mind, you'll realize that there are people in third world countries who do live a good quality of life, a meaningful life, a rewarding life, both from their own perspective and from ours.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.